My name is Bev Dalby. I'm the Research Director here at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Thank you for joining us today. The School of Public Policy is Canada's leading policy school, known for our practical research and for bringing people together to discuss important issues with experts, and that is what we are doing today. So I'm pleased to welcome you to this series of webinars hosted by the School of Public Policy. The recordings of the webinars can be found on our website and on the YouTube channel, and you'll receive a link in the follow-up email. The topic of today's webinar is municipal taxation during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our speaker today is Dr. Almos Tassonyi. Almos is an executive fellow and former director of the Urban Policy Program at the School of Public Policy here at the University of Calgary. Almos is an adjunct lecturer in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto and a research associate at the International Property Tax Institute. Almos has over 30 years of experience working in the Ontario Ministries of Municipal Affairs and Finance on municipal finance issues, and his international experience includes work in China, Hungary, and India for the World Bank, the Forum of Federations, and the Canadian Urban Institute. So welcome today, Almos. We'll have about 10 minutes to give a brief overview of the issues, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions and answers. You can type your questions into the Q&A box below, and I will pose them to Almos. So Almos, it's over to you. Let's start with the webinar.
Okay. Thank you, Bev. Thank you to the school for giving me this opportunity to share some information, and I hope that all of you are staying safe in this interesting times that we have. Now I'm going to try and see if I can pull up a presentation, maybe. Is that really is to understand the situation, we need to look at borrowing, taxing, and spending, which is a reversal of the usual way in which to frame this discussion. So even in the aftermath of the Black Death, cities were petitioning the kings about the demands on their resources being too onerous. So really the question is, how serious is the municipal cash crunch now? What are the demands from municipalities and their organizations, including immediate cash transfers, enhanced ability to manage budgets and borrowing, or new sources of revenue? And then we really do know now that the associations have also been lobbying for assistance. The FCM has a $10 billion ask and suggests using the formulas for the gas tax style. And there's also losses estimated now at around $2.4 billion on transit ridership. And CUDA has also asked for $400 a month for transit operators. I think the queuing has gone backwards, but we will continue.
Next slide.
Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so the broad outline of this presentation is to talk about municipal fiscal initiatives, mitigation, and the provincial-municipal relationship. Next slide, please. And so can we queue or not? So the significant questions really that arise is, should we be caring about the precariousness of city finances, taking priority over bailing out people and businesses and communities at large? And who needs to do something? What should they do? Do the cities need to deal creatively with their own resources? Or do other levels of government need to bring their resources to bear to cushion cities so that long-run urban-driven growth continues? These are really fundamental questions as to whether or not cities can manage their own cash resources through cash containment, interim borrowing, and other measures, or whether the senior levels of government are going to have to step in and provide transfers or other mitigation possibilities. Anyway, so perhaps we could move to the next slide. So this is an extremely sobering context because the burn rates for cash and reserves are high. We have concerns about the potential loss of the non-residential property tax base depending on what happens in terms of businesses' survival. And currently we have many municipalities that have had cancellation or deferrals of their user fees related to transit, recreational programs, deferrals of water billing and sewage treatment fees, and so forth. So the next slide is borrowed by me from a Facebook page of the Union of Municipalities in New Brunswick, who posted the FCM's numbers. I've added in, beyond the budget shortfalls that have been identified, the calculation of debt to tax ratios and the debt service out of operating revenue. These are somewhat standard measures that look at the sustainability of municipal finances. These, of course, are 2018 numbers. 2019 are not generally available as yet, and they do vary throughout the country. Where these debt tax ratios are above 140 to 150, that suggests that there are potential mandatory burdens that are going to face these municipalities in the short and the long run. And the debt service is part of operating revenue. Operating revenue and operating expenditures are usually pretty close, but this gives you some idea of the magnitude of how much of their current operating revenues are already spoken forth in order to meet mandatory obligations. The next slide is a summary of some numbers that I computed based on StatsCan data, and we can skip along to the slide itself. These will be available later. The first line really is a 10% of tax calculation, which just shows what the potential loss might be if 10% of the tax base disappears, again, based on 2018 numbers. This is a provincial comparison, and it's not per capita, so it is of course, will vary with the size. The interim borrowing really is an assumption as to whether municipalities could actually weather part of the storm by borrowing to what is often the max that's set by provincial statutes. That might be available, but of course, again, the rules are different in each province as to when those monies have to be paid back. In Ontario, as it happens, you can carry it for the year. The financial assets, again, are indicative that as StatsCan is collected, that municipalities do have financial assets, but those are contained in reserves and reserve funds, and some of them are restricted, some of them have been set aside for capital infrastructure purposes, and in some places, municipalities have the rights to actually change the use of those assets, in other places, not so much. The net worth calculation that StatsCan provides, of course, takes in current and future obligations, and so these are generally negative throughout the country. As it happens, BC municipalities seem to be in aggregate in a very enviable position with positive net worth. Elsewhere, the numbers are negative. And then lastly, I did a calculation again of the debt to tax ratio, but these are aggregate numbers to be treated with caution. But what it suggests is that, for example, Quebec's municipalities are quite heavily indebted relative to their taxes on an annual basis. And the situation is perhaps a little better in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, but again, in Alberta and British Columbia, the numbers are relatively high compared to the average. Having said that, there are also numbers available that suggest that there are still cash reserves as percentages of operating expenditures, but these are now, of course, being used up. Anyway, we can go further along quickly here. So really, this is then very quick. The municipal initiatives that have been taken so far and are recommended are essentially heavy-duty cash flow management, entering borrowing if your municipality feels comfortable with that, but it's to be recommended probably just in order to buy time, and cost containment in whatever means and ways possible. That there are, of course, legal constraints on what you do with your manpower and other considerations that you may have. Other municipalities, of course, have also implemented deferrals of tax deadlines, provided user fee holidays, and waived penalties and interest. So the next slide gives you some very quick summary, and this will be made available later, but it's really just trying to see what examples are of where people have actually made these adjustments in Calgary, Edmonton, Grand Prairie, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, Red Deer, and Wood Buffalo. And my sympathies go to the people of Wood Buffalo with the flooding situation that is current at the moment. In the Alberta municipalities, clearly the interim payments schedules vary and by province, and in some places they're statutory and other places they are not. So if we flip to the next slide, you can see that this will change for Ontario municipalities as well. Let's see, there we are. So in Toronto, for example, most residential people have actually got almost 8 to 10 due dates, and in many other municipalities there are multiple. So again, the day differences will vary in province and in municipalities, and by no means is this a comprehensive list. There are varying rules in each province for the installment payments that are available. So we can go on to the next slide, which are provincial and mitigation issues, which are being debated in the municipalities and by municipal associations. That is to say, in some places, rebates for residential taxpayers may be available, but often as not, there are fairly strict rules around eligibility for that. And non-residential mitigation through rebates is not usually something which is actually in the statute books. And the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has provided a very nice paper co-authored with Enid Slack and Thomas Hatcher on some of the criteria that can be used or should be thought through on the rebate question. So we can then go to the next one. Provincial measures, at this point, the ones that I've found most clearly and quickly have been British Columbia, which has opened up and authorized the interest-free borrowing from capital reserves and the flexibility to carry short-term debt for a year. Ontario so far, as has Alberta, made some changes to the due dates on education property tax installments. And there are other deferrals in place, including some related to the cash flow related to workmen's compensation boards or the various ways in which those are named. In Alberta, municipalities are being encouraged to enact voluntary deferrals, but the province has only at this point released documents which suggest that they are considering options related to loosening the rules around borrowing from capital reserves or interim borrowing as well. And these may be policy measures that are being considered elsewhere, but that remains to be seen. So in terms of the provincial municipal relationship, very quickly, there are legislative possibilities. Many of the municipal associations have been lobbying and or providing ideas to provincial officials and politicians, and these include borrowing rules. Bonusing rules are basically were divided in the 19th century to avoid races to the bottom, and there's a lot of reluctance to open up outright assistance to the commercial sector. Although if one looks at the Quebec financial statements and also the mitigation, there are small business and social economy loans that the interest is being waived on. And in some provinces, the power exists to do assistance grants outright. These have been used in the past for assessment loss and for disaster situations. And one of the most useful documents that I've come across is on the Municipal Finance Officers Association website. That has very good suggestions on maintaining separate ledgers and accounting frameworks to keep track of the expenses related to crisis situations. Because when it comes to the long and short run of provincial assistance, these may be necessary to document. Anyway, so we can go to the next slide. So the consequences here, well, we will see the issues being raised again about the role of the creatures, the relationship between the hierarchical relationship that exists between provinces and municipalities. The key considerations that economists will consider and other policymakers will want to consider in looking at any transfer payments or grants assistance are, of course, the long run, short run issues around hard and soft budget constraints and blank checks issues. Certainly the issue of who does what in the municipal framework. Ontario municipalities, for example, still have considerable and significant responsibilities in social service and others. And so the property tax carries a fair bit of freight. We will probably see a reinvigoration of tax field discussions as to whether some form of or access to the goods and service tax should be being made available to larger cities. And I don't want to understate the problems and potentials of provincial fiscal stability, given that the Bank of Canada has already given itself the power to provide a backstop to provincial and municipal bonds as well as corporate bonds. And some people will call that quantitative easing. So there we are. And hopefully this will circulate, because the last slide here really is more that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the AUMA-AMC, this has got a very handy guide for municipal leaders as well. On the GFOA site, there is a really nice document called Cash is King, which has very helpful practical hints for municipal decision makers. And that brings me to an end, because those are just the sources.
Okay. Thank you very much, Almos. So those of you in the audience, you can type in your questions and I will try to relate them to Almos. I'll probably paraphrase them, so that won't be word for word, but I'll try to get the gist of your question. So one question is concerns the non-residential property tax base. Almos, you talked about the potential erosion of the non-residential base, but what about the residential base? And especially, and here's a concern someone expressed about Calgary, is what if, because of the downturn in the economy, we're faced with net out migration and you know, the downward pressure that puts on housing prices and property values?
Well, at this point, it's very hard to get a crystal ball and say how many people will be in a very difficult situation in terms of having to move, leave, or vacate their houses. At this point in time, the municipalities and the province will probably have to look very seriously at loosening the constraints that exist in most municipal acts related to the residential tax base and assessment. I don't want to give you too long an answer, but my quick view is, having been involved in the legislation that insisted that collection was the main problem, coming to terms with assistance requires a whole different way of thinking about this. And it is going to require a concerted effort both on the municipalities and the provincial part to revisit the criteria that are used to assist residential taxpayers.
Then what about the non-residential tax base? I mean, again, here in Calgary, it's already been a problem issue because of the decline in the value of the office towers in the city's core. We can imagine that this is going to put even more pressure on it. What, in the medium to long term, do you think the cities can do with regard to taxation of non-residential property?
Well, that is a question has bedeviled policymakers for quite some time. And so in this particular instance, it's difficult because the arguments very quickly become, are there other sources of revenue? How do we actually cut back the actual load? And can the effective the balancing of the tax be rejigged? It's very clear from the evidence that over a long period of time, non-residential properties have probably taken a greater than what might be called their fair share. But in the midst of a crisis, it's very difficult to say, well, the residential side should pick up more. So this becomes very much of a concerted issue of what municipal responsibilities are, whether other tax fields should be open to them in specific cases, and this goes straight to the rethink of the rules. That is not a short-term fix by any means. In this case, I would go back to the only way right now to work this is probably buy some time, and I'm afraid that is either a borrowing question or a transfer question, because right now we're looking at having to do some immediate cash smoothing. Whether it's a 2-year or a 3-year picture, I don't know. But that would be, that's why I've argued about the interim borrowing rules and the cash flow issues, because I think we're going to need to buy the time.
So we have several related questions related to the finances of Alberta municipalities, and the question of whether there are unique issues here in Alberta, and to what degree are Alberta municipalities in danger of having to declare bankruptcy or pressed into dire financial situations because of the current fiscal problems.
Okay, so I will be brutally honest. I live in Toronto, and I did my thesis in Calgary on bankruptcy through the University of Calgary on Ontario municipalities going bankrupt in the 1930s. So this is to make all the audience laugh out loud. The numbers that I have looked at, of course, are dated. They are a year out because that's what's available. Some municipalities in Alberta are in deeper trouble. Just looking at very quickly at some of the base numbers, and then of course the impact of the economic collapse in those municipalities. At this point in time, the province should probably be fixated on identifying who's in trouble, who may require special assistance, and tailoring assistance to those who need it most in the immediate future. Having said that, the normal rule is provinces step in and run the financial affairs and visit the sins of commission and omission back on the local ratepayer, which is a difficult position to take. But having worked as part of the elephant, that's not a friendly answer. Alberta municipalities are in a difficult position because of the oil industry, because of the reliance in many cases on very particular kinds of taxation that are not the reliance elsewhere. And those situations probably going to require an individual analysis in each case. But there are some of the numbers are the debt to tax ratios, the debt service as part of the operating revenues are signals of potential difficulty. And so cost containment measures are probably not going to be enough.
Okay, because someone has asked the question about maybe more adjustment on the expenditure side because of the alleged notion that a lot of the cities have been engaged in mission creep and have given up a focus on what is really needed to provide in terms of the municipal services. So do you see much scope for the fiscal adjustment on the spending side by the municipalities?
I think that's going to have to be a part of it as well, and again, in a downturn situation, of course, that becomes a very difficult political question to address in terms of, how far do you actually cut back, and what is the mission creep? Because there are different kinds of this. Is this water and sewer growth? Perhaps not so much now, but in some cases, if you let your underground services go, then that poses its own problems. If the road network goes, that poses its own problems. So again, it's very difficult to generalize. This really is a sharpening of the pencils and making some very protracted local decisions. Now, I mean, having said that, we all know there's been mission creep in areas where it's not entirely clear that municipalities should be taking those responsibilities. I'm a horrible anecdote, but I mean, I worked in the 1970s and 80s in a regional government where the regional commissioner flatly refused to contribute to hospital financing because he did not view that as a municipal responsibility. Yet there were other municipalities in Ontario that did provide that. It wasn't precluded. And so there may be a need, and that might not be the most applicable example, but that's mission creep, and it takes a hard-nosed administrator to stop it.
Mm-hmm. So another couple of questions are related to the residential assessment. Some people think that because property values, I think especially here in Calgary, are likely to decline. What does that imply about property tax rates and also more generally about our property tax assessment system that could be changed in some way to deal with these volatility issues with regard to property prices?
Again, that's a very good question. The problem with it is I usually have very cold comfort to give, because if everybody's values are falling, the actual budget requirements probably do not. And so in some ways, what you have, the property tax essentially in the assessment system is really a way of distributing this burden. And if everybody's falling equally, then the burden itself may not fall. It will just increase across. Again, this kind of crisis raises issues about the whole issue of what property taxes do, how the assessment base is related to that. And I could go further and say we also, and in not part of this crisis, but the non-residential tax base was already an issue in the world of internet retail, and moving away from the capital structure based on property and land. And so this is a wrenching structural adjustment along with the crisis that is coming.
Well, thank you, Almos. We've reached our time, and I know the audience will have appreciated your views and insights and a great deal of information you've provided. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. This is part of our regular webinar series, and if you've enjoyed today's webinar cast, please go on our School of Public Policy website to look for future webinars on events and sign up as they're confirmed. So thank you very much.
Thank you for participating.